What could be more manly than a bear?
A lion?
The bros and alpha males and studs of Crazy Ex-Girlfriend are like the vain yoga instructors, dreamboat fantasies, and Crazy Ex-Girlfriends. Not what they seem. White Josh is the responsible friend, Hector loves his mom. But unlike specifically the Crazy Ex-Girlfriend label, are men so desperately in need of a second look? I read an article in Forbes sometime last year about DC Superhero Girls, an action and TV show franchise, and this was a follow-up to an earlier article. The underlying argument from that earlier article is that this separate but equal line represents a positive step forward as superhero property marketed to girls, but is a flawed one. Author Scott Mendelson has this to say: "Girls don't need a whole new girl-powered universe just for them, they just need to be included in the universe that already exists. His concern is that segregation suggests this is unusual." In the follow-up article, he elaborates, it's teaching women and girls to feel confident and empowered, that's good, instead of dealing with the mentality of many boys and men that creates the need for female empowerment in the first place. I buy that, and he continues with, I would argue that male de-empowerment narratives, or less overt male empowerment stories, will treat the disease better than female empowerment narratives that emphasize how unusual it is for a woman to be the hero of her story. Now, my reaction to this article was one of incredulity because women empowerment narratives of any stripe are so rare in my genre, science fiction, and as such are precious gems no matter their various defects. Take for example Ghost in the Shell standalone complex, which features a woman of such physical and professional supremacy it makes me legitimately angry that she's unique and not a default where it concerns other stories and storytellers. I wouldn't trade the Major or Balsa for male characters at the center of masculinity constructions, never. To be fair though, Standalone Complex does both, and with Saito's characterization of the Major, we see how women being super must exist in a context lest we kind of fall into the more fantastical images and ideas we saw on like 90s television post-Buffy that a lot of people don't take seriously. But the Major is made believable and realistic by the calibration of the context, which required a masculinity deconstruction. In essence, sometimes we don't have to choose between empowerment and deconstruction. Both contribute to a healthy ecosystem, and that's an ecosystem for the ages. In the case of Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, the women's empowerment is more about emancipation from patriarchy. It's about exploring the eponymous term and seeing women follow their dreams. Running parallel, but underneath this is perhaps a feminine gaze toward men, so it's a little bit different than the Standalone Complex approach. So much of the show is about rethinking roles and demolishing stereotypes, and it's that ecosystem again. If you're going to critique the Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, it's likely a criticism of its patriarchal architects will be part and parcel. In thinking about the egalitarian future Crazy Ex-Girlfriend's world suggests, we may ask questions like, what will the future of masculinity look like? What will men need to become? And will it be a radical change? Regardless the degree, what's the process? For the men in the audience, can we become like the bros of West Covina, or is that a fantasy too unrealistic to achieve? One of the things I've noticed about Rebecca is that she's very complimentary when it comes to sex. She compliments 3 out of the 4 guys she has sex with on the show, and that didn't ring odd to me until I heard about The Centerfold Syndrome by Gary R. Brooks. This is a book I saw referenced in a random research paper, the author of which gives it a succinct intro. Brooks has proposed the centerfold syndrome, a phenomenon wherein exposure to media that objectify women substantially influences heterosexual men's sexuality and disrupts their ability to form meaningful relationships with them. In his investigation of men's psychosexual dysfunction, Brooks discusses the need for validation. Heterosexual men are obsessed with performance, and that's measured by tactile responses of a woman's body, but also by something as basic as compliments. Another research paper provides us some examples. When a woman says, for example, "That was fantastic," "You're a stud," or "You satisfy me like no one else does."
That was amazing. You're really good at everything, actually.
Look, I'll let you off the hook just because you did me so good back there.
I mean, you're just so patient.
You really are awesome at that.
It also says that a need for validation encourages men to be promiscuous in order to have multiple women approve their sexual performance. This heterosexual male insecurity, in tandem with women's socialized conditioning to be supportive and encouraging, works against relationships. Now, this might be a strange thing to raise, but Rebecca and Greg's relationship starts out predicated on sex because anything else would be too complicated and then existentially threatening. And this is interesting when we consider Settle For Me and Josh as the basis for Greg's insecurity with all things Rebecca. Settle For Me is primarily about emasculation, which we find directly in the lyrics. Rachel Bloom notes that Rebecca and Greg's relationship is all about power dynamics, that in the makeout interrogation scene in the pilot, she's pleasuring him, but he's at her mercy. Settle For Me invokes traditional masculinity. It's a gentleman's seduction of a dazzling dame in nostalgic black and white. But of course, the theme of the number is,
yes, Josh is a dream, but I'm right here in flesh and blood and self-hate. Settle for me in a sad way, darling, it's fate.
when Greg's finally made it, Rebecca's no longer settling, and he's a man. It is that language and that mindset, even if he pushes against it when voiced by Hector.
But now, you're in the driver's seat, cruising down the 405, wind blowing in your hair, listening to Backstreet Boys.
It is a score. He's been validated, reassured he's awesome at sex. How much of this is competition with other men the way Valencia competes with women? How much of it exists in reaction to Josh? Those are things maybe we can't know, but it is the competition that put the final nail in the coffin. We begin with Settle For Me and end with the centerfold syndrome. Just as the back of the classroom needs to hear that feminism benefits men and women, the related but newer idea being processed here is that toxic masculinity, even when it's cute,
In what way?
is self-destructive as much as it is destructive. Again, and this turns out to be our refrain when talking about Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, it's so important that the character is sympathetic throughout. Men are so sensitive, we consistently demonstrate we must be spoon-fed feminism at a glacial pace. And so this criticism of traditional masculinity, traditional gender, is inviting rather than alienating. At that point, however, it might not be indicting enough to actually register. With regards to the relationship's end, we might still blame Rebecca for being in love with Josh, for example. We're not conditioned to recognize where toxic masculinity lies like a snake in the grass, and compounding on that, we are conditioned in so many other ways which run directly opposite regardless. So Crazy Ex-Girlfriend doesn't pile the basket with the eggs, it follows up on this criticism as part of offering further areas of exploration. Greg was convinced he needed to become the bad boy rather than just talk to Rebecca. He makes a hasty escape after the hospital, leaving Rebecca to talk to Heather rather than go straight to the source. Bros before tables, tables before bros, Greg and Hector, Greg and his dad, Rebecca and Heather. It's only Rebecca and Greg when it's too late. Part of the masculine mythology is that actually talking to Rebecca about this anxiety, being emotional, opening up to someone, is a sign of weakness. Granted, as we see in Season 2, Greg's difficulty with emotions comes in part from his alcoholism. This is something unfortunate that it isn't just about we recognize men's shortcomings and then the job's done, but that society has been laid in such a way that everything is connected, and one does not simply excise any individual piece of a problematic institution. Patriarchy in this way is like the opposite of Jenga. Greg's tendency toward toxic masculinity, however relatively benign, required a holistic solution to all of his problems. As an example of a man who doesn't need to be the bad boy, we have
Daryl Whitefeather.
Daryl Whitefeather, a fan favorite who struggles with emasculation throughout the show. His wife was cheating on him with a man who
doesn't cry at cat food commercials.
he's depowered as the boss of Whitefeather, and apparently this goes all the way back to his childhood. And yet he's a stronger person for it. Although off to a rocky start, his approach to countering Nathaniel's alpha male dominance is by building a bridge. And it works, whether it's always being open to someone's potential good, or balladeering for napping in the middle of the day.
Take a man nap! Come on!
I suppose a nap is somewhat infantilizing, and man nap is another example of constructive criticism, or whatever, where it isn't a complete satire on manly man culture, but posits that even manly men could use a rest sometimes. Of course, admitting life is hard backfires for Nathaniel in one sense, but humanizes him in the eyes of his coworkers. The show doesn't really ask us which is more valuable, because it should be obvious by now.
Hey, I'm really glad that you're somehow becoming nicer, but it's also kind of boring and... Stop. Please stop talking.
God bless Daryl. He's just so open, but he kind of hates himself for it. Understandably, because it leads to so much rejection, mostly by Paula, which in turn leads to,
You're my best friend, and I know I'm not yours, and that's okay.
which is Daryl's version of Settle For Me. Like Rebecca, though, he works very hard and often behind the scenes to accomplish his intrusive mission, which is make Paula admit she's my best friend. What he ultimately settles for is the number 2 spot in a hierarchy, and he's okay with that. But this is such a moment of vulnerability we don't often see with men in media, especially on television. Because it's not Daryl shedding tears because they burned down the Shaolin temple or kidnapped his girlfriend, or any number of okay reasons for men to break stoicism in the name of further stoicism. He's just navigating the complicated world of friendships, which may also require communication, no matter how vulnerable. Greg shows us the hazards of not communicating well, and Daryl the benefits of finally communicating well. It isn't easy for either of them, to reiterate the earlier point, crossing between what we see as gender roles. I remember a few years ago when anime fans were really hype about Kill la Kill, and people were describing it, half-jokingly, as the manliest thing ever, likely on the inertia of its forebear Gurren Lagann, and critics push back on that. Like, the idea you're going for is super intense and extreme and emotional, and those things shouldn't be gendered. And maybe this is also the case with heavy metal. The humor of What a Rush to Be a Bride, if I could continue explaining jokes, is the juxtaposition between heavy metal and delicate femininity. You could probably make the case it's reductive to either or both, but I think the earnestness shines through. It's the reclamation of something we gendered: high intensity, screaming, strobe lights. It's the perfect expression for Rebecca and Paula in this moment, for their ecstasy of gold as interpreted by Metallica. And then there's the Jap battle, and setting aside the problematic aspects, at least for this video, at the end of the day, we do have two women engaging in a rap battle. By and large, speaking to Americans at least, we are and shouldn't be strangers to women rappers. It's another male-dominated space, but that didn't occur to me when Rebecca and Audra went at it.
Back in college over winter holidays, bathroom stall at the matzo ball, and honestly I gotta say, really not hot at all. Small dick, rotten lay.
With this and with so many numbers, it's that same subtlety of subversion consistent with, for example, Key and Peele, where these two black guys insert themselves into all kinds of genres, and it's just instantly normal, despite being the creation of a new image. Hollywood is still a place where a certain type of person is at the center of the poster, and certain types of other people stand to the left and right, and that's normal. That's always accepted. It's one thing to say, of course I know women and black people can be anything in movies and TV shows, and another thing to see it. Crazy Ex-Girlfriend addresses an array of men, and treats them as fully developed people. It is mathematically unfair because we haven't had 100 years of women-driven Hollywood where men are disparaged, brutalized, absent, or objectified. And so while I won't celebrate this aspect of the show, it is a net positive. There's a kernel of truth inside male anxiety about feminism, that accommodation and various compromise are required by gender equality. We can lean back and say, women's voices need to be heard, but that requires listening to those voices, and that means diverting attention from whatever was previous. I guess that's a compromise, laughable it may be. But if we as men enjoy being seen as multidimensional in the way this show does it, I think we have to earn that. Actually be complicated and complex, and more than our libidos as a start. We have to care about emotions, and we have to talk to people.
Well, that was edifying.
Can we do this? I know it won't be easy. As a journey, it will be long and hard, and the balls are in your court. If you thought any of that was funny, stop proving my concern. And this was a follow-up to an earlier article. The underlying argument from that earlier article is that this separate but equal line represents a positive step forward as superhero property marketed to girls, but is a flawed one. Author Scott Mendelson has this to say: girls don't need a whole new girl, boys, and men that creates the need for female empowerment in the first place. I buy that, and he continues with, I would argue that male de-empowerment narratives, or less overt male empowerment stories, will treat the disease better than female empowerment narratives that emphasize how unusual it is for a woman.
What could be more manly than a bear?
A lion?
The bros and alpha males and studs of Crazy Ex-Girlfriend are like the vain yoga instructors, dreamboat fantasies, and Crazy Ex-Girlfriends. Not what they seem. A powered universe just for them, they just need to be included in the universe that already exists. His concern is that segregation suggests this is unusual. In the follow-up article, he elaborates, it's teaching women and girls to feel confident and empowered, that's good, instead of dealing with the mentality of many. White Josh is the responsible friend, Hector loves his mom. But unlike specifically the Crazy Ex-Girlfriend label, are men so desperately in need of a second look? I read an article in Forbes sometime last year about DC superhero girls, an action and TV show franchise.